Cool. Hello, everyone. Hi, Aaron. Hi, Brandon. How's it going today? All right. Today, we're going to be talking about CSS and specifically display and positioning. Kind of similar to the last classes, we'll have a session in the middle for questions and a session at the end for questions. But what I wanted to kind of ask, if any of you had any questions about the current week, please throw them in the chat like while they're fresh in your mind now, and maybe I can help incorporate them throughout the lesson. That'd be really helpful for me. I think it might be a little helpful for y'all to have a little bit of additional just more interaction there. This is by far the hardest week. Oh no! CSS is hard. Aaron, you are correct. And like I just said, I'm just going to type in the chat just so everyone sees it as well. If you have any questions, feel free to post them here. So I can get to them during the break. And specifically, if there are hard parts, or if there are parts about it that were specifically hard, let me know so then I can maybe kind of tweak and answer your particular questions. Because CSS, it is CSS is sometimes one of the most frustrating things to deal with as a web developer, at least from my perspective. Cool. All right, Brandon. We'll try to maybe get to figure out what was happening there. Okay, cool. So it sounds like there's some people here. We'll take a look at those questions at the break. But again, all right, we're talking about CSS and display and positioning, and kind of a big overview. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the box model, kind of the basic way that your website is styled. Talk a little bit about positioning. We're going to talk about the very powerful Flexbox, and we're going to get a little weird with CSS. So as a way of teaching Flexbox. So cool. Let's get started. So what is the box model? It's really the foundation of how elements are styled in HTML. It's the kind of blueprint for how we think about what an HTML element is going to look like with CSS on top of it. I think one of the best ways to kind of understand it is just to take a look at it. And so I'm going to pop open into the Chrome Web Inspector. I'm just going to go to, let's see, the Bootstrap website had a good, get Bootstrap, had a nice little thing to show. All right, so again, to open up the Web Inspector, you type Command-Option-I on a MacBook. And the selector with the square is the way you can kind of select different parts of the page. So let's take a look at one of these buttons here. And so it's an anchor element, an A element. And so if we look in the right side, you kind of have these different tabs, one of which is styles and one of which is computed. The computed styles, the styles page eventually shows you the box model that you're looking for, but what I like about the computed tab is it just kind of shows you right away what the box model is for a particular element. So if we look here, we can see we're looking at the Customize button, and the content itself takes up about 69 width pixels and 20 height pixels. And you have these different padding elements, and that's the green around. There's no border, there's no margin, and the position hasn't been adjusted at all. It's zero all around. And kind of one of the nice things about the Chrome dev tools is you can adjust these as you want. So you can make that customize a little bit bigger. You can see what would happen if you were, to add a margin to the left of 50. What's going to happen? Oh, boom, it gets shot over there, and you actually see what it looks like right there. And so one thing I would say, if you're having trouble understanding any of like the box model or display and positioning stuff, take a look at the inspector on a page that you want to see how it works, or maybe something that like hey, I want to have a nav bar like this. Well, take a look at what sort of attributes are on that box model, because I think it'll make you more better able to kind of learn on your own, which I think is one of the better ways to learn stuff like this. All right, so specifically, let's talk about padding. So padding is just the property that kind of sets the space between the content itself and the border. There are no negative values allowed, but it's just kind of a way of adding padding to whatever content you have. So within the box, whatever particular text or image that you have, it kind of adds a little bit of extra buffer between it. Buffer is the wrong word because I think I associate that with margin, but I mean padding really is the best word. But to kind of give an example of this just in the console, so we have that. I'm going to open up Atom. I created an index.html and a style CSS file. They're both blank right now, but what I did was I created a little shortcut that adds like just the basic HTML because I didn't want to spend too much time just remembering how to do it. And so that just gave me like the basic structure here. So if I want to look at the padding of a particular element, I can just type in, this is my example text, and close that out. And we can see what that looks like on a web page. So if I go to the file that I just created in week 4, oh, just kidding. We're just going to go here. Use the file explorer, display positioning, index. Cool. So this is my example text. I'm going to name the class is equal to text so we can play around with it with CSS. And, you know, so we know what it looks like, we'll say text is, its background color is light blue. So let's see what that looks like. Cool. So, so I'm also going to give it a width. We're going to get to this later, but the reason why you might notice that the example text stretches all the way across the page, and that's because it's a block element. We'll get to why that happens later, but what I'm going to do is just add a width of 100 pixels, or we'll make it 200 pixels. Just to give it like a little more shape that we can deal with. So you can see the width here and the height are what the background color is highlighting. There's no padding. If we were to add some padding, it would look like this. We'll add 100 pixels of padding. Let's see what it looks like. Oh, look, now all of a sudden my content is padded in by this additional padding. And if we look using the Chrome Web Inspector, you can then see, okay, that's the padding that was added. The margin, that margin that you see there is part of the fact that it's just like the block element kind of showing what it's doing. That would collapse, which we'll get to if there were multiple elements. But essentially, this is a block element, and we added 100 pixels of padding all around, and that's kind of the effect we have. The second thing we talk about is border. So border is exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of what goes on the outside of a particular piece of content. Just want to double check that everything's going. Cool. Goes outside. And so to set the border, there are a couple of different ways. One thing I didn't talk about with padding that I should have is there's a shortcut way of talking about padding. So if you just type padding and 100, it's going to put on the top right, left, or top right, down, and left of the particular element. But you could also have said, all right, let's talk about padding left and add just that item or just that attribute. Similarly, with margin, you can say margin add 100. Let's not add 100 pixels. Let's actually bring this down. Both of these down to 50. You can add 50 of that and then 50 of margin. And so if we go back here, well, I'm going to delete this real quick so you can see. All right, so without the margin, you just have this. You have this padding and you have this content, and it kind of sits up in the upper left-hand corner of your web page. The reason why it's not touching the corner is Chrome and other browsers have this kind of default, this sort of default HTML styling. And so to get rid of that, like, so if we wanted to brush right up against it, what we could do is to the HTML and body elements. So if we go back and look here, these are the HTML and body. They have these default kind of spacings that we can get rid of by saying, all right, actually, we don't want them to have any margin, a margin of 0. And well, that'll change that. And I think we also want to change the padding to 0. No, I don't think it has padding. Cool. that make sense? Yes. Cool. So that kind of gets rid of the default padding that was there on the left. So if we wanted to then add a margin to this, so say we wanted to then add a margin of 50, what would that look like? All right, so we add a margin of 50 and matting. This is what happens sometimes. Margin of 50, and you have it move all the way down because you can see from the updated styling, the margin has been added on all four sides in addition to the padding that's there. And so you can think about margin as kind of a way of the buffer on the outside of an element, and the padding represents that same sort of space inside. The big difference between the two is you can't use negative numbers with padding because that really doesn't make a lot of sense, given that like it's kind of like wrapping the content. And the second thing is this idea of margin collapse. And so I realized I didn't get to the border. So I'm going to finish up with margin collapse, and then I'm going to go back to the border really quickly. All right, so with margin collapse, it's this idea of you have two elements which are blocks which get pushed together vertically. And a way to think about it is if you have two competing margins from the bottom to the top of another element, the larger one always wins. And so, for example, if I have an element with a margin bottom of 20, and element on the bottom here with a margin top of 40, the total distance between these two elements as far as their margin is concerned is going to be 40. It's not going to consider the 20 because it's less than the 40. And that's abstract, so let's take a look at what that might actually look like in real life. And so we have text 1 and now we have text 2. We're actually going to name this, we're just going to add we're just going to have this be text 1, this be text 2, and we'll add that class name, and we'll paste this down so it looks very similar, but now we're going to add a new, some more syntax to it. All right, so without changing the margins, you can kind of see, all right, these kind of will rest on top of each other. Let's take the margin off of both and kind of see what happens. So they're going to kind of come together a little bit more. The margin that is between those two is just the margin of the so like I said, many elements have a default margin, so paragraphs have a default margin. So that's why you kind of see that space that exists as is. If we were to change this to something like a div, it might look a little different. Div might not be the best example, but yeah. So divs you can see collapse completely, whereas paragraphs actually have that default spacing there. And that actually explains why that wasn't changing. But so what I did there was I added the paragraph element to this this kind of resetting of the margins and padding. I can remove padding here as well. And so because Chrome and other browsers have default elements, you might like really get confused as to why is there padding here, why is there margin here? And the thing to always look for is does the browser you're using have a default styling for that? And so that's what happened here. And so when I reset that, you can see there's no margin at all. They're just right on top of each other. Say, for example, I add a margin bottom here of 20 pixels. So you're going to expect to see it shift down, and it does. All right, so now what happens if I put a margin top of 20 pixels here? What you might expect to have happen is it moves down another 20, but it doesn't. I'm refreshing here, it's not moving. And the reason that is you have two margins touching each other vertically, and therefore it just takes the bigger one. Since they're equal, it's just going to end up being 20, so it doesn't move at all. And so when you're positioning things vertically, that's something to always consider. If you're vertically trying to adjust margins, the bigger margin is going to win out. So kind of something to remember. I was supposed to talk to you about borders, so let's add one of those really quickly. All right, so these are both paragraphs, so I can just add on paragraph elements, a border. And again, here there's like a short style and a long style. If I wanted to kind of spell it out explicitly, I can say border color black, border width medium, and let's say border style solid. That's one, right? Cool. Now you'll see you'll have these two borders kind of placed right there, so you can kind of get that out. You can also, I believe, just type border black, medium, solid. I'm totally going to get this wrong. I think it's solid. Black, medium. I'm just going to comment that out. And you can see it's still there. So that's like the shorthand way. You don't have to write it all out. You can actually write it all in one line. It kind of just depends which way you want to go about it. Cool. I've already started talking about this a little bit, and so there's a couple of types of elements that you need to know about, or kind of the way things are displayed. And the two big ones, or three big ones that you run into are block, inline block, and inline. Block, inline block. And they're all just a little different way of how the elements will display on a particular page. Before I actually have a note here, as you kind of saw me do throughout that exercise, it's super important if you don't understand something with HTML and you want to kind of figure it out. I find it really, really helpful just to play around with the web inspector. And it's not going to say like you'll get instant answers or anything. It's just kind of a good way of experimenting. And so when I set those margins for top and bottom, I kind of said before I refreshed, what do I expect to have happen? And by kind of vocalizing that, I kind of say, okay, these are my expectations. Are they correct or not? And if they correct themselves or they're wrong, you need to update like your mental model of what you think should happen in that particular situation. So blocks are types of elements that take up the full width of the page and kind of stack vertically. And a lot of the elements you use are going to be blocks. So div, headers, paragraphs, lists, unordered lists, and there's just a ton more. I put a link here to the Mozilla Developers Network, where it kind of has a list of them. These are something that you come into a lot. And so if we take a look back here, and again, kind of take off the width of these, you'll see that the default behavior of blocks is to add this, to be the full width of the viewport, the whole width of the screen. And so it's super useful for when you want to define these huge chunks that go across the whole page. And they also stack, like as you build them. So blocks will stack that way. To contrast that, say for example, we wanted to add what's called a span, which is just, kind of just like the most generic elements. And we were to say this is an inline element. And we'll put it actually between here. So, and we'll add another one, is also an inline element. All right, so what happens here? So instead of having the new inline element go under and can kind of continue to create like topical, to continue to stack on each other, inline blocks will grow across the page. Eventually, once they get to the end of the viewport, they'll wrap around, as you might expect, like any sort of text, like it'll just wrap around. But it's kind of, the main difference between inline and block elements is block elements are taking up the full width of the page and will stack on top of each other, whereas inline elements will kind of just grow across the page and wrap. You can also make blocks behave similar to inline elements. And again, span was just one example of inline elements. Also, your anchor tags are inline elements, as well as like strong in code. Strong makes things bold and bolded. Code is kind of a way of displaying fixed width text in a website. But it's kind of interesting. Like I think you tend to use blocks a lot more because they're kind of like the structure of the site. But you do use like spans and anchor tags obviously a lot while you're building, so it's important to know how those behave. The kind of combination of these two is you have blocks that behave a lot like an inline element. And so if I were to instead say, all right, all P's actually, all paragraphs display not like a block as it normally does, instead do an inline block, you'll see a different behavior. Now it's shifting over, and they're able to sit next to each other like this. And so if I were to take out the width here and kind of show what happens, it's still going to behave a lot closer to what it like. So it's no longer stretching the width of the page. But what's nice is you're able to define the width the way you want. And so to contrast that, if I were to take this out here and go back in and add a span and say, I can't change the width of this, and I'm going to say this is my class is equal to inline span. Cool, inline span period for classes, and I were to say, all right, width 1,000 pixels and background color of pink. So, well, shoot. I can't do anything about the width here because inline doesn't kind of have this understanding of width. It kind of just has what's in the content. And so if you want that width behavior, you have to make the element behave like a block. And so if we change that, it is then able to kind of change what happens and change the width in that way. So it's an important thing to remember. If you're like, oh, why can't I change the span or this anchor tag to be the width I want? You might want to think, oh, well, actually it's because it's an inline element and you can't change the width of inline elements the same way you can of blocks. Cool. So hopefully that makes some sense. Let's talk a little bit about positioning. All right. So positioning kind of defines, if you look back to our fun Chrome dev tools, you can kind of see on a particular element. Ooh. I guess it's not showing it here. Well, maybe we have to add it. Maybe we'll look once we add it. So there's also kind of around the margin this positioning idea where you can move elements to different parts of the page based on the particular type of positioning that you give it. And so the different types are static, relative, absolute, and fixed. So static is essentially just the status quo. It's normal. If we were to go and look at these elements and look at their position, we should see it's static. So when we're focused on this example text, the position is static. Nothing really changes. That's kind of what you should expect. Relative is a little bit different. And so what relative means is, all right, if it were static, you would have elements display in kind of whatever way their block or inline characteristic dictates. But relative says, all right, given that normal position, I'm going to shift it over or move it up or down based on that. And so what I mean is, say we have, let's make these divs just for fun here. Ew. div. All right, so we'll make more of these, and we're going to make oddball, text oddball, and everything else is just going to be regular text. All right, so we no longer have any of those. Oop. We no longer have any of those. And this is now text, and this is now text oddball. think I spelled that the same. Cool. All right, so we're going to also delete inline span. And so taking a look, let's actually make these, let's make our divs, in this case, inline, display inline block for our purposes. Cool. And we want them to have that border again. So solid black 2 pixels. Does that work? Cool. A little thicker than that. Okay, a little ridiculous. That's fine. All right, so now we have these 4 divs in a row. They're inline blocks, so they're next to each other. So what does it mean to be relatively positioned? So in the normal world, this is where the second element would be, and we're going to change this to like lights or dark blue. Is that a thing? Ooh, that's not going to work. Much better. All right, so let's change the positioning type to relative, and what happens? My expectation is that nothing is going to change, and that's what happens. And the reason that is because we haven't given it any sort of like relative directions. So let's say relative to where you normally would be, let's move you to the left 25 pixels. Whee! So it moves over a little bit. I could also say from the top, let's go an additional 50 pixels. Woo! So it just moves down. And again, this is relative to the position it would be in normally. To contrast with that, there's this idea of absolute positioning. Absolute positioning, like the definition is position in relation to the nearest non-static element. And what the heck does non-static means? It just means generally relative or absolutely positioned element. And so if you remember when I looked before at the Chrome Web Inspector and I looked at the position here, most elements are static, but in our oddball we have this relative positioning. So when you switch something to absolute positioning, it's going to go to the nearest non-static element. All right, so if I change this again, I'm going to comment those out, and I'm going to say make this an absolute position. What happens? It's no longer going to have the, it kind of gets taken out of the normal rendering. And so it kind of says, all right, I'm going to render all of these elements, but the oddball is just kind of taken out of that. Instead, it's going to be positioned based off the last non-static element. In this case, that's HTML, because that's like the top level or body. That's where it's being positioned off of. And so it's just going to kind of appear right where we don't want it on top of other things. And this doesn't matter like how many other texts we have. So if we add a whole bunch here, it's just going to still stay in that same position. To kind of drive that point home a little bit, if we were to instead wrap this in a kind of parent text class, so we'll name this equal to parent text. Oh, cool. Nothing will change. Well, it's a div. Shoot. I'm going to do this. The reason that added, because I basically added inline blocks and the border to all div elements. That's why that had a border there. And so here, nothing has really changed. I've added this sort of parent element, but it doesn't really matter. So instead, I might add the class for parent text to be position absolute, and we're going to say left 100 pixels. And so what I expect to have happen is everything to move over, and that's kind of what happens. And so the reason that the pink box moved over is it's looking at its parent element and saying, what are you and what kind of position do you have? In the first example, like where I remove these, it says, okay, well, my parent that has a fixed element, the non-static one is actually HTML or body, so I'm just going to position myself off of that. However, if my parent has a position that is non-static, like absolute, I'm going to move with that and kind of base where I am positioned off of that parent element. And so I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing, but that's why I said again, like it's kind of like I would encourage all of you to kind of go through this same exercise with yourself and kind of build up something like this and just kind of tweak and play with the examples, because it's really the best way to understand what the heck is happening with CSS. All right, the last type of positioning I want to go over is fixed. And you can think of these as something for like a floating element. So say sometimes you're at a web page and you scroll down and the top bar just kind of remains at the top. Oftentimes you're going to be the developer probably used a fixed positioning to allow that to happen. All right, so let's take a look at our fun little web page and add a nice little, I'm going to delete this parent because we don't really care about that right now. And let's add a div class. Oh, class is equal to navigation. And this is where we navigate. Yeah. All right, so if we take a look at what that is, all right, we just have this plain old bar. It's not really doing much. So let's style it up just a little bit so we can see it. Navigation, we'll have it have a height of 50 pixels, you know, a width of, we want to go across the whole screen, so let's say a width of 100% of its, actually we don't even need to define that, do we? Well, let's add a width of 100% here. And then we'll also give it a color of, is light orange a color? That doesn't seem like it'd be a thing. Sherbert? Okay, now I'm just getting silly. Okay, orange. Oh, that's the color, not the background color. Cool. So now we have this navigation. It's not very pretty, but it's fixed. And kind of what that means is no matter how much text is on the page, or like how far down you go, well, this actually proves why I'm wrong. My expectation would be is that that bar would have stuck, but why didn't it move? If we go back to my style, I was under the impression that I had set the navigation position to be fixed. So now with this fixed value, we can see that as we navigate down, the navigation bar remains at the top. Something we haven't, I don't think, been introduced to, I don't think we talked about this in the lesson, is you kind of see how this pink element is displaying on top of that. There's also there's you know, your X and your Y of a web page, so there's like the height and the width, but there's also a depth that you don't necessarily see because it's a 2D screen, but there is the depth to the elements. And so the reason why this navigation bar is not kind of popping in front is the index value must be lower than the index value of that pink item. So I'm going to set it an arbitrary index value of 10, so that is just higher than the other values here. The element then pops in front and you can kind of see it painting over. So if you're ever having an issue of like, oh, why is this element behind another? You want to look at its Z index, and then you'll be able to kind of, if the higher number you have, the higher priority it gets. So you can kind of think of it as like a stack coming out towards your screen. And so that's just kind of something I've run into where it's like, why the heck isn't this working? It might be because your Z index is off. All right. Cool. All right, so now I'm going to take this time to take any questions about either what I've talked about or kind of what we went over in the class. So let's take a look at these. And feel free to just throw questions in there. We'll try to get to as many as we can right now. Do I have a shortcut key layout for Atom? I don't have one that I use all the time. Let's see, Atom key. Oh, this is what I use. I have seen this before. I'll give this a post here. I've used this in the past just based off the fact that it was in my search history. Generally speaking, though, I do use Vim, so it's a little bit different than a lot of it's a little bit different than a standard key editor. One thing that I use that is useful for all, I believe, is Shift V, and that's how I kind of like highlight big blocks of code like that. I think that's kind of a useful little thing I do. But these will kind of give you an idea of the vast number of shortcuts that are available. If I can give one piece of advice regarding shortcuts, is don't say like I'm going to use all the shortcuts now. Like I'm going to like every time I do something, I'm going to see if there's a shortcut and then incorporate it into my workflow. I think that's adding a lot of pressure that you don't need. I would instead just add like one piece that you find useful and just kind of work on that one until and like kind of let things happen organically. Like if you're thinking to yourself, oh, I'm doing this all the time, I wish there was a shortcut, that's when you want to look up the shortcut. It's not like you want to memorize the cheat sheet and then try to use them all. Just my personal way of learning. Your mileage may vary. But I found that like trying to learn a whole bunch of shortcuts like makes me not want to use something or not use as many shortcuts as I might had I just done it kind of one by one. So some food for thought there. I'm just going to, so for posterity, say this is a cheat sheet that I've used. All right. Which attributes should be used for a header? I'm not sure, Brandon. You might want to ask like one of the mentors. Like I think you're able to kind of reach out to them and kind of ask about particular projects, just because I look over the basic itinerary or the syllabuses of the classes, but I don't really go and do each individually. So when is absolute positioning useful? Just seems annoying. I mean, it just kind of depends when. It just depends. Like most of the time, I agree. Like I'll end up using a relative or a fixed type of layout, but off the top of my head, I can't think of an absolute, like when to use absolute, and that is probably more on me, just because I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah. I'm trying to think on the top of my head. Yeah, I can't really think of any particular like use for absolute. I'll try to think of that though, and see if I can't come up with a good example and talk about it in the next lecture I'm lecturing in. Does anybody else have any other questions about what I went over, or specific questions about like kind of concepts that were tough in the class? All right. I'm not seeing any, so I still have some time to answer questions at the end of the course, or at the end of the class, but just feel free to post them in here. All right, so Flexbox. Initially, when I was going to talk about Flexbox, is to say like whenever I have a CSS problem, everything's a nail, and Flexbox is the best hammer ever. And I don't want to say that like so unequivocally, but Flexbox is just a very, very powerful tool when it comes to centering parts of your page. And so I read up a little bit more about it, and you shouldn't try to use Flexbox as like you shouldn't only use Flexbox, I guess is what I'm saying. Like Flexbox is better for kind of like smaller elements and centering them within particular parts of the page. So think about it as like a more tactical tool than something strategic, meaning like you don't want to design your whole grid system using Flexbox. There's something called grid within CSS that you might want to use. Instead, think about Flexbox as a great way to center things within a particular part of your web page. The other thing is if your site's traffic is a little bit slower, if you use Flexbox, you'll have this sort of weird display jumble, like so it'll resize throughout the loading process. If you're building, if you're building websites for people in the U.S., it's probably less of an issue, but it's just something to kind of keep in the back of your head if you want to make your website super usable for people, regardless of how they're doing it. Flexbox might not be the best way to do it. It'll make the page, the user experience a little less enjoyable. That's something to kind of keep in the back of your head. That being said, like Flexbox is great. And so what I posted at the end of the lecture is this guide here, CSS Tricks Guide to Flexbox. Like the reason why I didn't create my own presentation for this part of it is this is what I use. Like when I have a problem, there are two websites. Like when I have a problem I need to solve with Flexbox, I literally have gone to these sites 85 to 95% of the time to understand like Flexbox and how I need to use it. And so the guide to Flexbox here, it kind of shows you the basic terminology is you have these two axes, right? You have a vertical axis and you have a horizontal axis. And basically what that's trying to describe is given an element of Flexbox, how will it grow throughout the page? And so you have this parent container and you have items within it. And again, what this flex direction is describing is how it's going to grow. So it's left to right is the standard, but then you could also have like a column format. And so what this is really great for, in my opinion, is vertical centering. Like I use this whenever I'm trying to vertically center like child objects. I basically come to this page and just use it. There are certainly other uses you can use it for. Like if you want to spread buttons out, you can use justify content in a nice way. If you need to move things from the top to the bottom, you can use align items as well as align self. But I think for me, Flexbox is one of those things where when you need to use it, like this is just the perfect guide to understand like how it's done. And so the way I was going to kind of show you how to use Flexbox was going to be doing like another kind of silly CSS example that was just going to be kind of abstract. And so we'll see how it goes. All right, so, wrong way. Let's go back to our sample web page here. And so what I'm going to do is erase all of that. Oh, we'll leave that part. But basically erase everything except for that margin bit, and then most of this here. And so if we go back to our page, it's now just a blank page. And so what I'm going to do is kind of create this this square with squares within it with different colors, and then do some fun hover tricks with it. And so it's probably a little easier for me to code it up and then kind of show you what I'm talking about. All right, so if we were to have a div element here, and we're going to do that a couple times. Indent, oh, no good. All right, and so each of these classes I'm going to name as like a particular level. So this is going to be class 1, class 2, in class 4. And now if I look here, again, I'm not going to see anything because they're just all, there's no content, so therefore like it doesn't have any sort of like real space to fill out. So if I then go and create, let's see, yeah, we'll just create, they call them 1, which is going to be, a width of 500 pixels. It's going to be a height 500 pixels, and we'll make its background color green. All right, and so what does that look like? Cool. I'm going to delete this for now. All right, so we have that. So let's then also do the same thing for each of the other ones. Instead of having a width of 500, we're just going to make it get smaller by half, so 50%. And then also make the height 50% as well. And we'll make the background color equal to blue. All right, so now you see it's in the upper left. I'm just going to do this again for 3 and 4 as well. And so just make it a little bit smaller each time. Background indigo, is that a color? I think so. And then purple, violet. Cool. So we have this sort of like rainbow-ish thing happen as you go towards the center of the circle. This isn't, or sorry, center of the square. But this isn't exactly what I'm looking for. I wanted something a little bit more centered, and so this is kind of where your flex box will come in handy. And so the parent element in this case is the one element, right? So if I were to instead change this to display is equal to flex, that's kind of your way of saying, all right, I want this to be a parent element of a Flexbox container. And so when I refresh, nothing really changes because I haven't told the children what to do. And so I want to justify content center. And if we go back to our fun little, oh, did I delete that already? If we go back to our Flexbox centering, it kind of lays out here, all right, when you want the items to be centered, you align item center and justify content as center. And so that's what we're going to do, justify and align items, both as center. Let's see what that looks like. Cool. All right, so the first square is in the center as we would expect, but none of the other ones are. And so the reason that is the display on these is not also flex. So if we look on the outside element and we look at its display, we'll see it's flex, but if we go to one of the inner ones, it's block still. So it's still going to have that same behavior. So if we add this to 2 and as well as 3, everything ends up shaking out completely centered. And so the reason this is happening is because you need to have centered items within a parent element. You need to declare the parent element as flex, display flex, and then you need to explain, or you need to give those attributes as well, so that justify content and align items to do this. So cool. So now we have this sort of centered thing, but it's not in the center of the screen. And so the reason why that is we don't have like this parent container to do the centering. So here again, I'm gonna, I guess there's a couple ways we could do this, right? So one way we could do this is just say, we can wrap this a parent div here, and we can say, all right, everything in this div, we're gonna call it the, circle container. Or sorry, I keep saying circle. Container, let's call it the container. And for the container, we will, we can do, we'll make it a display flex as well. Is that right? Yeah. And justify content to the center, and that moves it right on over to the middle like that. And so the reason why I call this getting weird with CSS is I also want to show like some of the additional features of CSS that you might not think about. CSS actually has some like animation and kind of weird fun characteristics that you can change that are not just related to positioning and display. But you could also do fun things like, for all the divs, set a hover attribute. And what that means is every time you hover over an element, you'll be able to do something. And so in this case, I'm going to add a filter. And a filter is just like a way of changing the color in a particular, or changing kind of what's happening on the element in a particular way. So here I'm going to say, all right, when you go over when you hover over any of the divs, change the color by like a sepia. It's just like think of it as like adding like an Instagram type filter, changing the color in a particular way of each of the div elements. So when I hover here, you can see it changes now in each one. It kind of has this kind of weird, fun little trippy type change to it. You can also, there are fun things like contrast, and that'll also change it. Atom autocompletes to kind of the different types of filters that are available. But it's just something fun to play with, really. It's not really like anything super, I wouldn't say super useful, but because it is a very useful tool. But it's just kind of, what I want to show you is that like CSS is more than just a way of positioning things and kind of displaying layout. It also adds like a sort of interactivity that you might not think about. Cool. And so the one other one, let's see if I can do this. There's also a border radius. Because I kept saying circles, so I must mean it. We'll say 50 pixels. That does it. Cool. So now you have this kind of like circular shape to it. We'll say 100 pixels. What does that look like? Getting more circular. So it's just kind of fun. I mean, there are different fun things to do. What if I did, is it a percentage based? 50%. Cool. And that's the way you can have circles with divs, is by changing the border radius. Essentially what that's saying is take your square and make it, make the border turn into like a radius of a circle. Which is kind of a fun way to make a silly little bullseye for your website. I don't know, I knew it was a little silly, but I thought it was a fun way of showing like you have these container elements and how you can change the shape or change the positioning such that everything is centered really easily. Cool. And with that, let's see. I have on the presentation all the links that I talked about during the presentation. So the CSS tricks, the vertical centering with Flexbox. Again, those are like just my gold standard of what I go to when I'm having trouble with kind of positioning things and wanting to use Flexbox. Take a look. They're great. I also linked to the block and inline elements, which is the Mozilla Developer Network, and it kind of just shows what elements are which. Again, the final point I want to drive home is the best way to understand the different parts of this, of positioning with CSS, if you're having trouble, is just to experiment. And like what I mean by that is kind of like in the 6th grade sort of way, like change something, say explicitly what you expect to have changed, and then verify that what you think, your hypothesis, is actually true. And in doing that, you'll update your mental model of how CSS works and how HTML works. And if you're honest with yourself and you say, actually, I didn't understand that, and figure it out, you're able to kind of build up this more accurate mental model that you'll be able to carry throughout your career. Soapbox off. All right. With that, where would those links be? Where can we go to download my presentation materials? I've actually been putting them all up on my GitHub, and I'll put these up at the end of the class as well. And so, under my repositories, you have the previous weeks here. You can go and find a PDF of the resume. Also, everything that I've worked on throughout the lecture, I'll throw up on GitHub. So there's the link to my GitHub stuff. Cool. Brandon, when you say when to use display, would you mind kind of elaborating on that? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. And also, if anyone else has any more questions, we have like 5 more minutes, and I'd love to answer anything I can, either about this or old stuff throughout the week. Just any questions you have generally, let me know, and I'd love to try to answer them in the time that we have left. No worries. That is A-okay. Yeah, again, the questions can be like about this week's, about like web development generally. Um, I'm here for you. So we allocated some time for questions. So feel free to ask me anything. All right, I'm not really seeing too many questions here. I guess going back to like how I use Atom. Some of the fun shortcuts that I use a lot are Command and Backspace. That'll move your tree in and out. So you can kind of navigate these files very easily and open them and close them, which is a nice feature. I also like add things from the command line, which is nice. So you can hit A to add a file, or you can also delete, files from here as well. It's kind of nice. To echo the point, Brandon. Like, I learned everything I just taught everyone from playing with websites and kind of building those toy websites that you saw. It's one of those things that's easy to forget, because when you build a website, like, you tend to you build it and then you tweak things, and so it's very easy to forget like exactly what margin does, exactly what padding does. And so the best way to kind of jog your memory and to understand it better in the first place, in my opinion, is to go and build like that toy website. And so if I go to MDN and talk about positioning. So again, MDN is the Mozilla Developer Network. And you'll see that one of my examples was kind of based off of this. Yeah, so you can kind of see like they show like MDN is a really great gold standard place to learn about the way web, HTML, CSS, JavaScript work. And so you can see here, like, this example looks kind of similar to what I was doing, and that's intentional. This is what I based my example off of. But what they talk about here, and what I would encourage you to do, kind of like what Brandon said, go in and use, go ahead and build your own toy website, build your own toy example, and tweak it, play with it, figure out what you don't understand, and then hopefully you'll understand it a little better. Slay, I guess I have this, maybe I could add this one. That's what I was just looking at for positioning. It kind of helped me learn it. Brandon is... Bootstrap is a tool for kind of making a website's overall display a little bit easier. It's what's called a framework, and so frameworks tend to be what we say in web vernacular, opinionated. So with Bootstrap, you kind of have this. There's one way to do something, and it's kind of this big columned approach, and so things are divided into columns and kind of in these big, large displays throughout the web page, and you can kind of see like each of these pictures here is a column within it. And so what Bootstrap is used for is, I want to get a nice looking website out quickly. That's what people use Bootstrap for. It's kind of like, it's not that you don't care about the design, it's that you do care about the design, but you don't necessarily have the resources or time to put into making like a very full-featured website. I don't want to say that. it's a way of building nice websites quickly. Those websites are all going to look and feel kind of similar, but they're all going to look kind of nice. And that's kind of the benefit of using Bootstrap. Cool. All right. Any more questions before I sign off? Hopefully that was helpful. I'm actually not going to be here next week. I'm going to be out of town, but another mentor is going to come in and do my seminar next week. Gabriel, he's great. So I believe it's going to be Gabriel anyway. But I'll stay on for like a minute more. If anybody has any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to sign off and kind of, yeah, I'm just going to sign off. Oh, cool. Flex Froggy. Let's take a look. Cool. This looks fun. Oh, fun. Cool. I'll post this in the chat. Cool. Well, yeah, it seems like a really fun, gamified ways of learning. I think are a really great way to get introduced to different concepts. That's really cool. Thanks for sharing, Brian. Cool. All right. I'm not seeing too many more questions. So thanks everyone for listening. Hopefully that helped again. And I'll see y'all in 2 weeks. Oh, won't let you put it in there? That's interesting. That's good to know. Yeah, if there are any links you guys know, or if any of y'all know, post them in Slack because I think that's kind of like the preferred method. But this is also a great place just to kind of share them if you want me to put them out here like this. So thanks for letting me know, Brian. So the other one I knew about, which you don't like, it's not what's it called? Vim Zelda. Vim Adventures. It's just kind of a silly way of learning Vim. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to folks only because like this is something a little bit more I don't want to say advanced, but like I think it takes away from learning basic web development. But Vim Adventures is kind of like a fun way, at least the basic levels. This is how I learned how to use Vim, which is a particular text editor. Not even loading that well. Oh, it's kind of a way of moving around differently. And so I'll post that in the chat. But again, I would caution people, like, you don't have to learn how to do this. This is just something I used as a way to, it's a text editor I use. It's weird, so like it eventually I think is a great productive way to type, but like don't feel like it's kind of like some people like it, some people don't. So don't feel obligated to take a look. Cool. All right, with that, I think I'm gonna head out. But again, have a great couple of weeks, and I'll see everyone. Then. Have a great weekend, and good luck with everything with Code Academy. Take care.